Imagine yourself standing in the middle of a battlefield during World War II. The air is thick with smoke, the ground trembles beneath your feet from artillery fire, and the screams of wounded men echo all around you. You clutch your rifle, your hands trembling, as enemy soldiers advance toward your position. Your sergeant yells, "Open fire!" You raise your weapon, peer down the sights at a man just 100 yards away, a man you've never met, who has done nothing to you personally. And in that split second, something inside you hesitates. You pull the trigger, but your shots go high. Or maybe you don't fire at all. Maybe you just pretend to reload, or you fire wildly into the distance, anywhere but directly at another human being. Now, here's what's truly astonishing. You are not alone. In fact, according to one of the most explosive and hotly debated military studies ever conducted, the majority of soldiers in combat, some estimates say as many as 75 to 85%, never actually fired their weapons at the enemy with the intent to kill. That's right. In the heat of battle, when their lives were on the line, most soldiers either didn't shoot at all, or they deliberately fired in a way that would avoid killing. This revelation didn't come from some armchair historian. It came from a man named Brigadier General S.L.A. Marshall, a journalist turned military officer who spent years interviewing soldiers immediately after combat in World War II. His findings, published in his 1947 book, Men Against Fire, sent shockwaves through the military world and forced armies around the globe to completely rethink how they trained their soldiers. But was Marshall right? Or was his research deeply flawed, even fabricated? And what does this tell us about the very nature of humanity, about our instincts, our morality, and the psychological cost of war? Today, we're going to dive deep into one of the most fascinating and controversial subjects in military history. We'll explore Marshall's bombshell claims, the science behind why human beings resist killing even in life or death situations, how modern militaries have tried to overcome this instinct, and the haunting consequences of turning ordinary men into conditioned killers. Let's start with S.L.A. Marshall himself. Who was this man, and how did he come to his startling conclusions? Samuel Lyman, Atwood Marshall, known as Slam to his friends, wasn't your typical military officer. He began his career as a journalist covering everything from crime to politics, before eventually becoming a military historian. During World War II, he served as an official combat historian for the U.S. Army, and it was in this role that he developed a groundbreaking technique: the after-action interview. Unlike traditional military debriefings, which often focused on tactics and logistics, Marshall's interviews were intensely personal. He would gather soldiers together in small groups, sometimes just hours after a battle, and ask them to recount exactly what they did or didn't do during the fight. And what he discovered stunned him. Time and time again, soldiers admitted that they hadn't fired their weapons. Not because they were cowards, not because they froze in fear, but because, when faced with the moment of truth, something deep inside them resisted the act of killing another human being. Marshall's most famous claim was that, across countless engagements in World War II, only about 15 to 25% of infantrymen actually fired their rifles at the enemy. Think about that. In a squad of 10 soldiers, only 2 or 3 were actively trying to kill the enemy. The rest? They might have been loading their weapons, aiming, even pretending to fire, but they weren't shooting to kill. Now, you might be thinking, how could this possibly be true? War is brutal. War is chaotic. Surely in the heat of battle, soldiers would do whatever it takes to survive, right? Well, Marshall's research suggested something profoundly counterintuitive, that the natural human instinct isn't to kill, but to avoid killing. He described cases where soldiers would go to extraordinary lengths to avoid shooting directly at the enemy. Some would fire high, intentionally aiming over the enemy's heads. Others would simply go through the motions, loading, aiming, but never pulling the trigger. And in some cases, soldiers admitted that they would rather charge the enemy with a bayonet or throw grenades than look a man in the sights of their rifle and pull the trigger. One particularly striking example came from the Battle of Okinawa, one of the bloodiest conflicts in the Pacific Theater. Marshall interviewed troops who had fought in close quarters combat against fanatical Japanese defenders. Even in these brutal conditions, many American soldiers confessed that they had never fired directly at an enemy soldier. Some said they deliberately shot at debris or empty positions to make it seem like they were participating in the fight. Others admitted that they would fake malfunctions with their rifles, pretending their weapons had jammed just to avoid having to shoot. Why? Why would soldiers, trained for combat, armed and in mortal danger, refuse to kill? Marshall argued that it came down to something deeply ingrained in human nature, a fundamental resistance to taking another human life. This wasn't about cowardice. It wasn't about lack of training. It was about morality, instinct, and the weight of killing. To understand this better, we have to look beyond Marshall and into the broader science of killing. Because while his findings were controversial, they weren't entirely new. In fact, as far back as the 19th century, military observers had noticed similar patterns. A French officer named Ardent Dupic studied combat behavior during the Napoleonic Wars and found that soldiers often fired wildly into the air rather than at the enemy. Even in the American Civil War, there were reports of entire regiments firing volleys that somehow missed their targets completely, not because of poor marksmanship, but because of an unconscious reluctance to kill. Modern psychologists like Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman, author of the book on killing, have built on Marshall's work to explain this phenomenon. Grossman argues that human beings have a powerful, innate resistance to killing their own kind. It's not just a social or moral conditioning, it's biological. In fact, studies of ancient warfare suggest that even in primitive combat, most fighting was posturing, intimidation, and non-lethal engagement rather than all-out slaughter. Grossman breaks down the human response to combat into 4 categories: fight, flight, posture, and submission. What's fascinating is that posturing, making a show of fighting without actually trying to kill, is one of the most common responses. This explains why, throughout history, so many battles have been decided not by sheer killing, but by one side breaking and running. But here's where things get even more interesting. After World War II, militaries around the world took Marshall's findings seriously, maybe too seriously. They realized that if they wanted soldiers to kill more effectively, they had to overcome this natural resistance. And so, they completely revolutionized military training. Gone were the days of shooting at bullseye targets. Instead, soldiers were trained on human-shaped silhouettes that popped up unexpectedly, conditioning them to shoot reflexively without hesitation. Language changed too. Enemies were dehumanized with terms like gooks, krauts, or hajis to make killing psychologically easier. Training became more intense, more repetitive, designed to bypass the conscious mind and turn killing into an automatic response. And it worked. By the time of the Vietnam War, firing rates had skyrocketed to an estimated 90 to 95%. Soldiers were killing more efficiently than ever before, but there was a terrible cost. PTSD rates soared. Many veterans returned home haunted by what they had done, struggling with guilt, nightmares, and a profound sense of moral injury. Which brings us to the big question: was Marshall right? Or was his research flawed? Because in the decades since Men Against Fire was published, historians have dug deeper into Marshall's methods, and some have found serious problems. In 1988, military historian Roger Spiller conducted an extensive investigation into Marshall's work and found something shocking. There was little to no evidence that Marshall had actually kept detailed records of his interviews. No notebooks, no transcripts, no systematic data. Some of Marshall's own assistants later admitted that he often relied on memory and generalization rather than hard data. Critics argue that low firing rates in combat could be explained by other factors: poor visibility, the chaos of battle, the fact that most shots in war are suppressive fire rather than aimed shots. They point out that in some battles, like D-Day or Iwo Jima, soldiers clearly were trying to kill the enemy, often at point-blank range. But even if Marshall exaggerated his numbers, his core idea that human beings resist killing has been supported by other research. Studies of police officers, for example, show that even in life-threatening situations, many hesitate to use lethal force. The point isn't that soldiers never kill. It's that killing doesn't come naturally, and that overcoming that instinct has profound psychological consequences. So what does this all mean for us today? It means that war isn't just about tactics and weapons. It's about human nature. It's about the terrible burden we place on soldiers when we ask them to do something that goes against their deepest instincts. And it's about the moral cost of turning killing into a conditioned reflex. As we look at modern warfare, with drones, remote-controlled weapons, and even AI-driven combat, we have to ask ourselves, are we making killing too easy? And if so, what does that do to the soul of a soldier? What does that do to the soul of a nation? These are questions without easy answers, but they're questions we must keep asking. Because the story of S.L.A. Marshall and the ratio of fire isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a window into the darkest and most profound aspects of what it means to be human in the face of war.